The studio lights blazed like spotlights in a courtroom, and the audience leaned forward with the anticipation of a trial. The segment was supposed to be another comfortable moment for Nicolas Maduro, a platform where he could parade himself as untouchable, dismissing international criticism as imperialist noise. For years, he had thrived on controlled environments, staged rallies, loyalist reporters, choreographed applause. But tonight, things would be different. Because across from him sat Karoline Leavitt, the young voice who had turned congressional hearings upside down, who had humiliated seasoned anchors, and who never flinched when the political stakes were highest. The moderator opened with the kind of question Maduro loved, a softball about sanctions. He leaned back smugly, talking about resistance, about sovereignty, about the people's will. But Karoline wasn't here to talk about slogans. She was here to confront him with something far more damning, the bounty. Everyone in the room knew it. Everyone outside the studio knew it too. $50 million. The U.S. government's offer for information leading to Maduro's arrest. It hung in the air like a storm cloud. Karoline let him finish his rehearsed lines, then leaned forward. Her voice was calm, but her words cut sharp. Mr. Maduro, you call it sovereignty. The world calls it corruption. You call it resistance. The world calls it drug trafficking and human rights violations. And now, you've turned what was supposed to be your biggest badge of honor into the single biggest mistake of your career, because the bounty isn't going away. People don't forget when the price of your capture is higher than the GDP of entire nations. The audience froze. The moderator tried to shift, but Maduro's eyes narrowed. For the first time, his smug smile faltered. Karoline wasn't shouting, she wasn't ranting, she was calmly reminding the world that no matter how many speeches Maduro gave, no matter how many propaganda videos he pushed, his name would forever be linked with that reward. The reward that made him look less like a president and more like a fugitive. The tension thickened. Cameras zoomed in on Maduro's face, catching the brief flicker of unease. Karoline pressed harder. And here's the truth, Nicholas. You thought this reward would fade with time, that headlines would move on. But I'm making sure it doesn't. Tonight, millions are watching. And they're remembering. Your biggest reward has become your biggest mistake. The audience erupted. Half in shock, half in applause. Maduro tried to regain control, but the battle lines had already been drawn. The clash had begun. Maduro tried to laugh it off. Fake numbers. Yankee theater, he said, palms up, as if the accusation could float away on the stage lights. But Karoline had not come empty-handed. She slid a slim folder across the desk toward the moderator. Tabs, timestamps, logos from independent NGOs and international monitoring groups. The camera found the top page, grainy satellite stills of a jungle airstrip, followed by an annotated map of trafficking corridors that bent like arteries through the Orinoco Basin. Here's the part you won't enjoy, she said, voice steady. Flights that never filed manifests. Fuel shipments that vanished. A police colonel who retired the day before the evidence trail reached his office. And the humanitarian aid caravans you blocked while hospitals ran out of antibiotics. She didn't raise her volume. She lowered it, and somehow that made every word land harder. You can chant sovereignty all night, but the facts don't recognize your slogans. The moderator cleared his throat, glancing between them. President Maduro, would you like to? Of course, Maduro cut in. This is colonial fiction. A child reading scripts from Miami. He flashed a television smile to the audience. Tell me, señorita, did your producers also write the tears for your closing scene? Karoline didn't blink. No. But a lot of Venezuelan mothers did, over empty cribs. She tapped the folder once, then opened a new tab on the studio tablet, mirroring to the big screen. A hallway monitor, dim, shaky, captured a nighttime queue outside a clinic. A woman's voice, weary and matter-of-fact, we bring salt water to pretend it's saline. The room sucked in a breath. Even the moderator stopped shuffling his notes. Maduro leaned forward, jabbing a finger. Propaganda. Anyone can fabricate. Then why, Karoline cut in, do your own ministers keep resigning the week they're subpoenaed abroad? Why did 3 of your pilots defect with flight logs? Why did your former intelligence chief beg for asylum and bring a hard drive like a black box from a crash site? A murmur rolled across the audience. The control room threw up a split screen, Maduro's jaw tightening on one side, Karoline's profile lit like a statue cutting through fog on the other. She didn't relent. You thought the reward would scare whistleblowers into silence. It did the opposite. It gave them a number for the risk they were already taking. Beat. And it told the world how confident investigators are that you don't survive sunlight. Maduro slumped back, switching tactics. Sanctions starved our people. You celebrate suffering. Karoline nodded once, as if she'd been waiting. Sanctions didn't design your currency. Sanctions didn't dissolve your legislature. Sanctions didn't order soldiers to fire on kids with cardboard shields. She let the silence sit. Do you know what those kids wrote on the cardboard? Pan y futuro. Bread and a future. There's your referendum. A low wow leaked from somewhere in the back row. The moderator tried again. We need to. One more, Karoline said, eyes on Maduro, not the camera. You can call me young. You can call me American. But you can't call me wrong. She lifted the folder once more, almost gentle now. Aviation fuel invoices, bank wires to front companies, the customs officer who vanished after scanning a pallet labeled grain. Your greatest reward wasn't an insult. It was a mirror, and tonight, you can't look away. Maduro's smile finally cracked. The audience felt it, the micro-defeat, the hairline fracture in a fortress facade. He reached for the glass of water he hadn't touched all night, hand shaking just enough for the lens to catch it. Karoline didn't crow. She just let the image hang there, the man who called himself unshakable, rattling under fluorescent truth. The moderator stared into camera 1, voice a touch hoarse. We'll take a brief break. The red light blinked off. The crowd didn't move. The story had shifted, and everybody knew it. The break ended, but the tension never left the room. When the red light blinked back on, viewers across the world leaned in closer. Nicolas Maduro returned from the pause with his chin high, but the faint tremor in his hands was still visible to the keen eye. Karoline Leavitt, on the other side, hadn't moved much. Her folder was still on the desk, the documents stacked like an unspoken promise that more was waiting. Señorita, Maduro began, forcing confidence into his tone, you can parade whatever papers you like. The empire has always created false evidence to topple sovereign leaders. They did it in Chile, they tried it in Cuba, they even tried it in your own elections. You are a tool, nothing more. His voice rose now, pounding the desk with his palm, and tools are thrown away when they are no longer useful. Karoline tilted her head slightly, her gaze never breaking. She let the pause grow uncomfortable, deliberately allowing the silence to show that his fury only fueled her calm. Then she answered, not with volume, but with precision. A tool doesn't bleed. A tool doesn't cry. A tool doesn't carry names. But this folder does. She slid out another sheet and placed it flat for the cameras, a list of doctors who had fled Venezuela in the past year. These people aren't weapons. They were healers. And they left not because of sanctions, but because your government left hospitals without medicine, salaries without value, and children without futures. The crowd behind the cameras murmured again, that restless sound that signaled a turning tide. Maduro clenched his jaw, trying to force the image of strength. Lies, he barked, waving his hand dismissively. Exaggerations by people paid by Washington. But Karoline didn't argue point for point. She leaned forward slightly and said, with chilling steadiness, then why do they risk their lives to testify in exile? If this is all Washington's fantasy, why does your former intelligence chief call you a traitor to your own nation? Why does every defector, every whistleblower, tell the same story of corruption, smuggling, and blood. Maduro's face stiffened. He leaned back, searching for words, but Karoline pressed the advantage. She pointed toward the camera, speaking now not to him, but to the millions watching. Every time he denies, remember the voices silenced at home. Remember the students with no books. Remember the parents who bury their children before they can even walk. Her voice broke slightly, but deliberately. It wasn't weakness, it was conviction. You can deny me, but you cannot erase them. The moderator's eyes darted nervously between the two, realizing the power imbalance had shifted again. For the first time in the debate, Maduro looked cornered not by statistics, but by stories. And Karoline knew it. She sat back, folding her hands, letting her last words linger like smoke. You call me a tool. But tonight, I am only a mirror. And you are afraid of what you see. The studio erupted in a low roar. Viewers at home felt the walls tightening around Maduro's defenses. The debate was no longer just politics, it was a trial, and the evidence was mounting. The moment Karoline's words landed, the studio atmosphere thickened with a gravity that no lighting crew or sound engineer could control. Nicolas Maduro shifted in his seat, the sweat at his temple betraying the facade of control. His fingers drummed anxiously on the desk, each tap echoing like the countdown of a clock he could not stop. For years, Maduro had spoken to audiences who had no choice but to listen. Now, for the first time, he was pinned in front of someone who not only refused his narrative but shredded it with evidence. Enough of these accusations, he shouted suddenly, his voice rising above the murmur of the audience. This is theater, propaganda designed by the CIA and their mouthpieces. Venezuela will not bow to lies. He slammed his fist against the desk for emphasis. But the move felt rehearsed, desperate, a man trying to manufacture strength where none remained. Karoline didn't flinch. She slowly pulled another sheet from her folder, raising it with deliberate slowness, so the cameras could catch the seal at the top, an international report, stamped and signed by a coalition of human rights observers. This isn't Washington. This isn't Langley. These are doctors, journalists, and church leaders from Europe and South America who all reported the same thing. Thousands imprisoned for protest, food rations traded for loyalty, families torn apart by militias under your command. The camera zoomed closer on the page as she laid it flat. They are not paid by Washington. They are paid in courage. Maduro tried to laugh, an awkward, shallow chuckle that rang false. These so-called observers are pawns. You think you can sit there, a child of privilege, and lecture me about my people? I have lived with them. I have eaten with them. His tone sharpened, leaning in like a predator. Can you say the same, Karoline Levitt? The studio lights caught the flash of steel in Karoline's eyes. She leaned forward, her voice low but steady, cutting through the noise like glass. I don't claim to be one of them, Mr. Maduro. But I have spoken to the mothers who crossed into Colombia carrying children too weak to walk. I have listened to fathers who sold their wedding rings to buy medicine on the black market because their government failed them. And I'll tell you this, they don't care if the truth comes from Washington, Brussels, or Mars. They just want someone to say it out loud while you're forced to listen. The audience erupted into a mixture of gasps and applause. The moderator raised his hand, trying to regain control, but the balance had already shifted. Maduro's attempt to frame Karoline as naive had backfired. She had turned his question into a confession of his failure. And then, with the calm of someone who knew she had the upper hand, Karoline leaned back and added one final dagger. You don't fear me. You fear the voices I carry. And that fear is why you're losing, not just this debate, but your country. The words hung in the air like a verdict, impossible to erase. The crowd knew it. The cameras knew it. And deep down, so did Maduro. The roar from the audience carried over into the next moment, and Maduro, still visibly rattled, tried to regain composure. He leaned back in his chair, forced a thin smile, and said, "You think applause changes reality?" My country has survived coups, sanctions, and sabotage. I am still here, still standing. Unlike you, I don't need the West's validation." The words came out louder than he intended, echoing with a defensive tone that betrayed his unease. Cameras caught the twitch of his jaw, the way his hand clenched around the water glass before setting it down too hard, a dull thud against the table. Karoline allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, letting his words collapse under their own weight. Then she calmly reached for a small booklet she had kept close, its cover instantly recognizable, a Venezuelan constitution. The crowd leaned forward, murmurs spreading like wildfire. "You talk about survival," Karoline said, lifting the booklet. "But you swore an oath to this document. An oath you've broken again and again. Free elections, protection of basic liberties, guarantees of fair treatment under the law, every one of these promises has been shredded under your watch." Her voice carried a deliberate calm, like a surgeon making a precise incision. Maduro's eyes flickered toward the booklet, and for a brief second, the cameras caught something raw, a flash of recognition, maybe even guilt, buried beneath layers of denial. He quickly masked it, scoffing loudly. "The Constitution means nothing when foreign powers weaponize it against us. Don't lecture me about democracy when your country interferes in ours at every turn." Karoline's response was razor sharp. "This isn't about Washington. This is about Caracas. This is about the children eating out of trash bins in Maracaibo, the teachers walking out of classrooms because their salaries can't buy bread, the families risking everything on rafts across the Caribbean. Don't hide behind the shield of foreign interference. This is your responsibility, Mr. Maduro. And every time you deflect, you confess your failure." The audience broke into applause again, this time louder, with some even rising to their feet. A chant began to ripple from the back rows, faint at first but growing, "Libertad. Libertad. Freedom." The moderator tried to interject, but it was clear the energy in the room was no longer in his control. The chant spread, and the cameras captured the faces in the audience, some Venezuelan exiles, tears in their eyes, others clapping with fists raised high. Maduro leaned in, his voice dropping into a threatening growl meant only for Karoline, though the microphones caught every word. "Careful, girl. You are playing with fire." Karoline didn't blink. She leaned in just as close, her whisper sharp enough to slice through his menace. "No, Mr. Maduro. You are sitting in it. And the people holding the match are your own." The studio erupted. It was no longer a debate, it was a reckoning. The chants of "Libertad" reverberated through the studio, echoing far beyond the walls into living rooms across the globe. It wasn't just a crowd reaction anymore, it was the sound of a people long silenced finally finding their voice through someone unafraid to speak it. The camera zoomed in on Karoline's face, steady, composed, but charged with an electricity that seemed to flow directly into the audience. She hadn't just challenged a dictator, she had turned the debate into a stage for truth. Maduro tried to wave it all off with a dismissive gesture, but his hand shook as he raised it, betraying the nerves that no bluster could cover. He forced a laugh, low and hollow. "They cheer now," he said, his tone edging between sarcasm and desperation. "But they cheered Chavez too. They cheered me when I stood against imperialists. These people," he jabbed his finger at the audience, "they forget. They are fickle. Their applause means nothing." Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice cutting clean through the noise. "No, Mr. Maduro. They haven't forgotten. That's the problem for you. They remember the empty shelves. They remember the soldiers at their doors. They remember the promises you broke. And tonight, they are reminding you that your time of control is ending." The moderator tried to regain balance, stepping in with a nervous question about international aid. But the debate was already unshackled. The cameras caught Venezuelan flags waving in the back rows, people rising to their feet, their chants colliding into something unstoppable. Maduro's frustration boiled over. "This is propaganda. A circus. You bring a young American here to lecture me about my people? She doesn't know Venezuela. She doesn't know what it means to lead a nation under siege. His voice cracked mid-sentence, anger fighting against fear. Karoline turned toward him with an icy calm that seemed almost rehearsed, but it wasn't. It was conviction. You're right, I don't live in Venezuela. But I listen to the people who do. And they are louder than your excuses. If leading means starving your citizens while you cling to power, then you've redefined leadership into tyranny. And history has a way of swallowing tyrants whole. The room exploded again, a tidal wave of applause, whistles, even tears. Some in the audience clasped hands, others raised their fists, while the cameras beamed the moment into homes across Caracas, Miami, Madrid, and beyond. For the first time in the debate, Maduro had no words. His lips pressed together, his eyes darting left and right, searching for rescue, but there was none. The image of him, trapped in silence while chants of Libertad drowned the studio, would become the defining moment replayed for weeks to come. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply sat back, her posture unwavering, her eyes locked on him, making it clear, she wasn't there for points. She was there for truth. And truth had just broken through his walls. The silence from Maduro stretched on for too long, and in debates silence is death. The cameras didn't cut away this time, they lingered, zooming on his tightened jaw, on the way his fingers clenched against the podium as if gripping power itself. The audience noticed. The world noticed. And Karoline, reading the moment with the precision of a seasoned fighter, refused to let the silence fade without striking the next blow. She leaned forward slightly, not shouting, not mocking, just sharpening her words like a blade. You've spent years building palaces for yourself while the people of Venezuela line up for bread. You've filled prisons with dissidents while your allies fill their pockets. You call me a foreigner, but let's be honest, you're the one who's abandoned your own people. Her tone was low, steady, the kind of voice that cuts deeper than yelling ever could. The moderator tried to steer the debate back to foreign relations, but the audience roared too loudly. Some stood on their feet again, others were wiping tears, their cries of Justicia colliding with the earlier chants of Libertad. The studio had become less a stage and more a battlefield of voices, and Karoline was the clear commander. Maduro finally snapped, slamming his palm on the podium so hard the microphone screeched. Enough, he barked, his face reddening. You have no right to come here and poison this debate with lies. These are our internal matters. America has no place here. He jabbed the air with his finger again, but his gestures no longer carried authority, they looked frantic, defensive, almost pitiful. Karoline didn't miss a beat. It's not about America. It's about freedom. And freedom doesn't belong to one country, Mr. Maduro, it belongs to humanity. The fact that you think questioning tyranny is a foreign concept tells the world everything they need to know about your rule. Gasps filled the room. Even the moderator froze, sensing that history was happening live. On social media, clips of the moment were already going viral, hashtags exploding in both English and Spanish. People in Caracas began filming themselves shouting Karoline's words in unison, broadcasting defiance from balconies and streets. The weight of it all pressed in on Maduro. His sweat was visible under the lights, his composure unraveling. For the first time, he looked less like a dictator and more like a cornered man. And Karoline? She stood straighter, almost serene, her presence radiating the kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from knowing you are on the side of truth. As the audience thundered again, she raised her hand slightly, not to silence them, but to channel their energy into the final point of the round. Her voice was clear, undeniable, tonight, the world has seen the truth. And no amount of shouting, no amount of intimidation, will erase it. The Venezuelan people have spoken, and their voice is louder than yours. The applause crashed down like a tidal wave, and the camera cut between her calm expression and Maduro's unraveling face. The contrast told the whole story, one leader rising, another collapsing under the weight of his own lies. The air in the chamber had turned into something close to electricity. Maduro's earlier smirk had faded, and Karoline's words were still hanging in the air like sharp glass. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady but carrying the kind of edge that cut through the noise. You talk about rewards, but what you handed out was a bribe. And what you called strategy was nothing more than selling your people out. The room erupted, not with applause this time, but with shouts, reporters shouting over each other, trying to capture every syllable. Maduro tried to speak, but the crowd's energy had shifted. Karoline had tapped into something deeper, and her words struck like lightning. The world is watching you, she continued, and they see not strength, not courage, only desperation wrapped in arrogance. A hush swept over the space, the kind that comes before an explosion. And then it came, thunderous claps from the audience, echoing like gunfire across the chamber. For the first time, Maduro looked cornered, his body stiff, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. Karoline had made her move, and there was no going back. Reporters later said they had never seen Maduro rattled like that. His usual bravado slipped, and instead of defiance, he leaned on empty slogans. "We stand strong," he muttered, but even his voice cracked under the pressure. Karoline didn't let him off. "Strong leaders don't buy silence," she fired back. "They earn respect. And right now, you have none left." The cameras caught the moment, Karoline standing tall, eyes unwavering, the embodiment of defiance. Maduro, suddenly smaller, his hand gripping the podium as if it might keep him from collapsing under the weight of truth. Social media lit up within seconds, hashtags of her name eclipsed his, and clips of her sharp rebuke spread like wildfire. Even critics had to admit, she had turned the confrontation into a spectacle he could not control. And that was the point. Maduro wanted dominance. Karoline gave him exposure, the kind he would never recover from. The session ended, but the fallout had just begun. Outside, crowds had gathered, and when Karoline stepped into the night, she was met with chants and raised banners. "Truth wins," they shouted. Her words had traveled beyond the chamber, beyond the broadcast, it had become a rallying cry. Maduro's camp rushed to spin it, but the damage was permanent. Every headline paired his name with hers, but only one came out stronger. Commentators repeated the same theme: she had dismantled his greatest weapon, fear, by refusing to bow. Standing on the steps, Karoline delivered one last line for the cameras. "Dictators fear one thing more than power slipping away, truth spoken out loud. Tonight, the truth won." The crowd roared back, and with that, she turned and walked into history, leaving Maduro's legacy crumbling behind her. My friends, tonight wasn't just about exposing Nicolas Maduro, it was about proving that truth still has a place in a world drowning in propaganda. What you saw on this stage wasn't a clash of personalities. It was the voice of the people, the cry for freedom, rising louder than tyranny. Maduro can hide behind power, behind wealth, behind lies, but what he cannot escape is the judgment of the people he has betrayed. And tonight, their judgment rang out like thunder. I stand here not as a politician, not as a performer, but as a messenger for those who have been silenced. And I promise you this, so long as dictators believe fear will win, there will always be voices brave enough to break it. The world doesn't belong to those who abuse it. It belongs to those who defend it. And together, we will write the story of freedom, louder, stronger, and more unstoppable than ever before.